Hey guys, first Regardsman here, and today I'll be talking about Space Marine 2 and 10 hidden mechanics this game does not tell you, but really should because they will dramatically change your gameplay. This game is absolutely chock full of random perk interactions, weapon effects, and fundamental control options that will only mention to you a single time, and in some cases it will mention them to you at all, or they are only mentioned in patch notes from like a year ago. And after around 5,000 hours of playing and making content for Space Marine 2, I am still learning new things and hidden interactions, so today I want to go through some stuff that I see players ask about a lot, and some stuff that's been lost to the patch notes, or really more so buried by the Inquisition until now. So hopefully by the end of this video, whether you are a brand new or veteran player, you guys will learn at least a few things you were unaware of to improve your experience with the game. Now the first thing I want to talk about here is actually something that the game does tell you, but most people have completely forgotten about. And I know that every single one of you has interacted with this mechanic at least once because it is in the tutorial of the game before you even get to the battle barge, and that is of course the lock-on mechanic. This is actually a super useful ability, and to check the hotkey of this ability, all you have to do is go into your controls and see the corresponding key or button. And once you activate this, it will lock you on and pull both your attacks and your camera towards the enemy that you are trying to fight. And this is actually very useful for weapons like the Power Fist and Power Sword that have single target attacks that you really want to be centered on one enemy that you're trying to kill. I use this all the time in my game, and players constantly ask me what the random triangle on my screen is, and that is simply the representation of the enemy you are locked onto, and the three white blocks here represent 33.3% of their total HP. This is also how you can see how close to dead something is beyond the base like red horizon on them, or like, red aura. The number one thing you need to be careful with when it comes to this though is that the lock on will drag your camera heavily in this game, which can completely screw up your character movement and get you hit by attacks you intended to dodge. So making sure you unlock yourself from an enemy when you are trying to avoid attacks should be a top priority, but beyond that awkward moment, this feature is incredibly useful in the game for heavier attacks, even if it's a bit finicky sometimes. The next tip I want to give here is about the Biovores. It seems like everybody who plays Space Marine 2 just absolutely hates this enemy, and I really can't blame them. Spore Mines already hated long before Biovores even came out. Even after the addition of the Battle Simulator in the Purgation update, you still can't practice against these guys as they are completely absent from the Battle Simulator for some reason. But something players absolutely need to know about the Biovores is that when they are planted, they will take 0 damage from equipment, and they will cover their faceplate, which is where their headshot multiplier usually is. There is actually an upside to them being planted like this though, which is that the body shot damage they take is doubled when you shoot them in the turret, making weapons like Plasma and the heavy bolt rifle when you use crack and penetrator rounds incredibly effective against them. So if you see a Biovore planted in the ground, save the grenades and shoot them in the turret instead, as this will kill them significantly more quickly. And speaking of saving grenades, this brings me to the next thing I want to bring up, which is really just a PSA about not spamming bosses with your frag grenades. This is probably the most obnoxious thing for your teammates to do to you in all of Space Marine 2, and is also something new players especially need to be aware of, which is that the equipment in this game does not do a substantial amount of damage to a lot of the Terminus spawns, and the frag grenades especially do next to nothing in terms of damage, but what they will do is stagger your teammates that are standing near the boss. And bosses like the Carnifex are already completely immune to stagger in Space Marine 2, so if you frag your teammate that is trying to time his parry and you detonate a grenade in his face, well now he's stuck staggered and unable to parry, but the boss will still be winding up its gigantic melee attack. So just be aware your frags are better spent on Extremis and Majoris enemies, because staggering these guys is actually valuable, or if you really want to frag a boss, then keep it to the Chaos Terminator Sorcerer, since he is susceptible to things like this where others aren't. The fourth thing that the game will not tell you is in regards to block weapons. Now I have a full guide on the defense types in Space Marine 2. I want to give a TLDR here about the block weapons. Block weapons may not seem that good initially since they are explained nowhere to you in the game, but in reality they give you a ton of extra damage reduction versus things like range and melee attacks, since every perfect block will give you a 60% range damage reduction for around 2 seconds, and you can also stack Adrenaline Surge stacks to get back your armor from attacking enemies, unlike fencing and balance that will only give you armor back for parrying Minoris enemies. The 60% damage reduction can be absolutely life-saving against things like flamethrowers or Tyranid Devourers, and sometimes it is in your best interest to perfect block an enemy because of this. And something else that players ask me all the time is, how do you survive on Absolute, and more importantly, how do you survive a true solo? And the biggest thing here that will improve your gameplay in not just true solo but also your group Absolute operations is the RNG of the box spawns. In Space Marine 2, the game director will heavily prioritize what you need the most at a given time, so if you currently have no stims and are lower HP, or better yet you have a mortal wound, the next box you break open is incredibly likely to give you a normal or restorative stim. The easiest way to make sure this occurs for you is to top off your ammo and your armor before you break open a box at low HP, as this will give the director more reason to prioritize the medkit you actually want. Doing this can give you substantially more medkits throughout your game. Just keep in mind there is a cooldown of around 90 seconds after receiving a medkit from a box, where you are significantly less likely to find another one if you break open a box again. Now, this next tip is regarding the perk Intimidating Aura. This is already one of the best perks on not just the Bulwark class, but really the entire game. And even though this perk description says it only works on a perfect parry, it will actually work on a perfect block as well. This perk is actually particularly useful for block weapons, since slower options like the Thunder Hammer's block variant occasionally need just a little bit of extra damage to actually reach and execute on enemies, and Intimidating Aura makes that significantly easier to obtain. So if you're afraid of using block weapons since you want to keep your Intimidating Aura perk, just keep in mind you can in fact use both. Another incredibly useful piece of information in this game is that armor will actually damage cap against enemy melee attacks. A lot of players actually undervalue armor in this game since it doesn't feel that useful initially, but armor will give you a full damage reduction against melee attacks regardless of the amount remaining. This means that if you have a sliver of armor and get a Hellbrute Hammer or Carnifex Claw in your face, you will take 0 damage, and those attacks are also the ones that love to stagger you, which makes it even harder to get back your contested health, which armor completely eliminates having to deal with in the first place. This is why perk effects like Focus Restoration and the Bulwark's Banner are so powerful, since even slivers of armor have a lot of value in this game. Now, one of the biggest status effects in the entire game beyond things like armor regen is of course no knockback. A lot of players will read these perk effects and see they say you can't get knocked over, but then they go in game and get staggered anyways. So what is actually going on with these perk effects? Well, these basically work by reducing the stagger of an incoming attack by a tier. So in Space Marine 2, a massive hit from a Carnifex will knock you over completely. Meanwhile, things like a normal Sword Warrior swipe will just stagger your character with a much faster recovery. So what the no knockback perks actually do in Space Marine 2 is they reduce that knockback by a tier. So basically, if you were to get knocked over entirely by a Carnifex hit and you have no knockback active, you will instead be staggered, and a staggering attack will do nothing to you instead from a Whip Warrior or a Tyranid Sword Warrior. This is why no knockback is so strong in Space Marine 2, since it pretty much means you only have to look out for heavy unblockable attacks that would interrupt your melee swings rather than almost every attack from certain enemies. And one more thing I want to mention before we get into our final tip is that enemies in Space Marine 2 have damage sensitivities, and most importantly, ranged enemies will take 50% more range damage from your attacks. This is incredibly useful to more quickly eliminate enemies like Rubric Marines and Devourers, because if you're playing something like a Stalker Bolt Rifle or Plasma, being able to just blast apart the ranged enemies more quickly than a normal melee attack could is a really good option to keep yourself alive and keeping your entire team alive, because they will definitely thank you for blowing apart the annoying enemy ranged enemies like the Bramble Warriors and those Devourers. So just keep that in mind, that your range attacks, they will do more damage to ranged enemies. And this brings me to the final thing I want to talk about in this video, which is in regards to the Ordeal system. If you don't know what Ordeals are, these are simply the in-game challenges to unlock cosmetics for your characters, weapons, and armor, and more importantly, it's the place you unlock the capes and iron halos that most of the player base actually wants, alongside things like tabards and cloaks. Now, something the game will never tell you about these ultra grind ordeals is that loading up the custom stratagems game mode and setting it to hard mode will not only count as absolute difficulty, but you can also turn on all the positive modifiers you want to make your game far easier while still having the game actually count as absolute difficulty and not having to actually worry about anything else. Saber has also come out and said they will not be nerfing this method, and this should also hold true for PvP private games as well, since not only can you turn on custom stratagems for your ultra grinds, but you can also enter private games with your friends for PvP ordeals in the game if you have enough of them to efficiently farm those as well. This is actually how most of the game's player base got their capes last patch, and Saber made the wise decision of not interfering with that, since it was overall harmless, and nerfing this would probably have caused an uproar, especially after the voice pack DLC controversy, which was the single biggest controversy Space Marine 2 has ever had, and directly preceded the patch 13 update we got the absolute cape grind. But those are 10 things in Space Marine 2 that are incredibly useful to know, but the game will not tell you anywhere pretty much. And while making this, I have to say that after playing this game for the past 2 years, a lot of this information is tossed around by the dedicated player base like it's common knowledge, when the game itself has really made zero effort to teach anybody about its hidden mechanics. And there are obviously even more things in this game that are hidden, and I'll probably talk about those in the future as well. But for now, hopefully this gave you a better understanding of Space Marine 2. I also hope that in the future, Saber Interactive will actually tell the player base more of this in an updated tutorial or something, since at the moment, the base game tutorial is incredibly undercooked and does not properly represent the current state of the game at all, at least in my opinion. But that is everything I have to say in this one, guys. If you like content like this, subscribe for more. If you want to catch me live to ask me questions questions about the game, or just come hang out, you can find me here on YouTube or on Twitch with a link in the video description. I'll say a link to my community Discord. I also want to say a special thank you to all my channel members. You guys have been incredibly supportive the past 2 years, and you help me make guides like this, so I really cannot thank you enough. And as always, thank you for watching. Take it easy. Bye.